Hello. This is the lecture on question documents. It's being recorded for JS 110 Introduction to Forensic Sciences. My name is Jason Linville, and this lecture is being recorded in the fall of 2017. So if you're accessing this archive lecture in future semesters, all the material still applies. But if I mention anything about, I don't know, Thanksgiving or Roy Moore or who knows what else is going on this week, you can ignore all that stuff and just focus on the presentation. All right, so where we're at in the class is question documents is still sort of in the area of traditional forensic science that you'll find in a lab, but we're really starting to get into some of the related areas. Question documents, similar to trace, is one of those areas that may or may not be found in a forensic science laboratory. And question documents probably even less than trace evidence. Usually there's a couple agencies, as we're going to see, that have question document sections. So if there was a situation in Alabama where they needed a question document examiner, they would probably send the evidence out to an outside person for analysis, either other government lab, or I'm not even sure if they can do contracts with private question document analysts. All right, when it comes to evidence, as far as question document evidence, it usually falls into two categories. We're going to talk about, well, maybe three categories. One is handwriting. So we'll talk a little bit about handwriting and handwriting analysis. And as we go through the traditional questions of what is the rarity of the evidence, is everybody's handwriting unique? Does your handwriting change over time? All of those have some fuzzy answers that go along with them. The other thing is counterfeits or authenticity of documentation. So that's a big part of question document analysis, and that may be something that local law enforcement runs into and has to get an outside agency like Department of Homeland Security or ICE, Customs with the U.S. to help out with. And then the other type of analysis would just be trying to link a document to either through ink analysis or paper analysis, or if you want to find out not in a criminal case, but like if somebody took out the page of a will and substituted in another one, then that could be it. Or Sarah throws an example in there where if there was a threatening letter sent to a girl after she dumped her boyfriend and he said he didn't write it, and there you could use handwriting analysis, or you could also think about the paper and the pen. Okay, so if you could somehow link the paper, if it had a weird watermark on it, that was from the guy's dad's company, and it just so happened there was a notepad, sitting in the boy's home. Then if you can link the paper to that pad, that's a good piece of evidence. Again, that's linking an object to a place. Or if you can link the ink, if it was some bizarre ink, and I say the word bizarre ink, and that sort of leads into another problem with question documents that we have with trace, in that the rarity of the evidence is often a situation where it's not very rare. All right, so we're going to talk about ink examination, paper examination, and then if you want to throw an extra bullet in there, I'm just going to mention very briefly question document analysis, which, do I have my wallet with me? Or did I take it out of? Yes, I do. I'd like to show everybody my driver's license just so you know what the heck I'm talking about when it talks to document analysis. And then we're going to talk a little bit about machines as well. So it's just we're going to be all over the place, again, like some of these other lectures where we just have a little bit on one topic, then move on to a different topic. But it's all within the realm of question documents. All right, one thing that I think I switched around in this lecture is we're going to go ahead and begin with handwriting analysis and then move into the more traditional stuff. I think, is this just a preview slide? Oh, it is a preview slide. Okay, so handwriting, maybe this is the one thing that annoyed me. Okay, handwriting analysis should be another bullet there, although I guess it's split into document analysis and handwriting analysis. Okay, so we're going to start with document analysis, and then we're going to come back to handwriting analysis. Okay. So ink analysis, let's take that threatening letter. If you could somehow link the ink in the threatening letter to the pen that wrote it and somehow prove that that pen was either owned by or possessed by your suspect, then that would be a good way to link the material, sort of through the Locard exchange principle, where I don't know, it's kind of an extreme version of it. Your suspect makes contact with the pen and then physically rubs it on a piece of paper while writing. That can be helpful. Also, if we're dealing with authenticity of a document, the ink analysis within the document, if you think a document's from 1979, but you find the toner that was used to print it out wasn't invaded until 1992, then that suggests some problems with authenticity. Or ink analysis can also reveal alterations that we're going to see. The classic example of that is I write Sarah out a check for $100, and then she squeezes a 1 in front of it and changes it to $1,100. Okay. I'm not going to be writing anybody a check for $100 tonight. Sorry to disappoint you guys. Okay, so when it comes to ink analysis, remember we talked about paint analysis, which is, I guess, similar to ink. There's like a liquid component, and then there's the pigments and dyes that are dissolved in that liquid. So when you look at the chemical components of ink and you look at the pigments and the dyes in there, it's important to remember when it comes to the question of rarity of evidence that the same ink is going to be used in multiple pens. I mean, obviously, if I go out and buy a Bic Crystal or I don't have anything up here, or even like a Sharpie, just a regular Sharpie that has pigments in it. Obviously, somebody else can go out and buy the same Sharpie, the same Bic Crystal pen. Okay, but it may even be where Bic uses that same black ink that they use in their crystal pens. They may use that in other types of disposable pens. Okay, it may be that they buy their ink from a company that also sells the identical ink to Papermate or something like that. All right, so the same ink can be used in many pens or even by different brands. So it would be the same thing that we did with the trace evidence assignments, where if you can identify that's Antron Lumina fiber, whatever it is, then perhaps you can go to the company that made the ink and find out a little bit more about how widespread its distribution is. Okay, how do you analyze ink though? Well, what are some of the traits of ink? Obviously, you can look at color, but when it comes to identifying the color components, one easy test to do is thin layer chromatography. And we talked about thin layer chromatography a little bit with drug analysis, but here we're going to talk a little bit more about the thin layer chromatography method. And also I want you to be familiar with some terms, primarily stationary phase and mobile phase, that are used in thin layer chromatography. All right, so how thin layer chromatography would work is, especially in the example of Sergey, if you have a threatening letter and you want to analyze the ink on the letter, then how do you get that ink transferred to a piece of thin layer chromatography paper or silica membrane, or the term is falling out of my head. It's not called a piece of paper. Well, they do make chromatography paper, but also plate, a chromatography plate. So what you would do is, like in a lot of other drug or DNA evidence, you try to get your evidence into a liquid form. You try to dissolve it in liquid. So oftentimes what you do is you would take a punch of the ink of the letter, or cut out like one of the letters that has the ink in it, and then drop that little piece of paper with ink on it into a small test tube, and you would add some solvent. And when we do this lab I think we do it in 350, we add like methanol to it. And then the methanol will dissolve a lot of the dyes and the pigments off of the paper into that ink, and then you can dry the ink, you can dry the methanol down, and what results is sort of this sticky residue that you can then, with a paper clip or a needle or something, transfer and put a little dot here on the thin layer chromatography paper. So where's my little thing? So you put sort of a dot there at the bottom. Okay. Now, the type of paper that you put the dot on, or a silica plate, okay, which is sort of looks like paper except it has like a chalky coating on it. That's the stationary phase. Okay, this is the phase that the ink is going to move across. So the phase itself does not move, but the ink moves across the phase. All right, now in order to get the ink to move, what you end up doing is you drop the stationary phase in like a big jar, and the jar is filled with liquid, and you just put the tip of the paper into the liquid. And the liquid here is called the mobile phase. because if you've ever put a Bounty paper towel, or whatever brand you prefer, Brawny, I guess I have Brawny in the pantry right now. If you put it like a corner of a paper towel in a little puddle of water, what happens? The water like starts to wick through the paper towel and sort of eventually starts to moisten, the entire paper towel, or a good portion of it. So it's the same thing. The liquid starts to move up this chromatography paper, or the chromatography gel, and it sort of smears the ink as it moves. Okay. But again, the ink is our sample, so it's actually the liquid that you choose to put it in is called the mobile phase, and the paper is the stationary phase. And when you do thin layer chromatography, you can actually choose different types of paper, different types of stationary phase, and you can choose different type of liquid. Okay, you may use ethanol, you may use acetone, you may use ethyl acetate, or a combination, a solution of a variety of different liquids. So as it travels and smears the liquid, smears the pen ink, what's going to happen are the different components of the pen ink, the dyes and pigments, are going to move at different rates in that mobile phase. So you may wind up, after all is said and done, with a purple dot, a purple pigment or dye from the ink, that's moved very quickly, very quickly and very far through the paper, whereas then you have a little dot here and a little one here. So you sort of get this pattern of different colors. Whereas starting off, this stationary phase the ink may have just looked like a blue dot. Okay, and this ink looked like a blue dot as well. You can see once you separate them in thin layer chromatography, they look quite different. Okay, and then if you have your unknown sample and it looks like this, you can say, oh, well, that pattern looks very similar to the first the first ink I tested. Or if you have a pattern like this, then you can say, oh, well, that looks very similar to the second ink I tested. And in fact, I think both of these inks are the same, the C and the SG here. Okay, and then these sort of represent the knowns over here. All right. Okay, so that's thin layer chromatography. Again, this is the diagram that you're going to see on the quiz or exam that everybody gets wrong, so pay attention. Hopefully you won't. I'm going to ask you, what is the mobile phase and what is the stationary phase? Everybody always wants to say like the start dot is the stationary phase because it hasn't moved, and then like these are the mobile phase. But no, the ink is the sample. Okay, the stationary phase and the mobile phase is what you can choose. So the stationary phase is the paper, okay, and you can use different paper, or silica gel, or different types of chromatography paper. And the solvent is the mobile phase, okay, because that is also something that you can choose, but the solvent is going to move through the stationary paper. All right, so that's your terminology. And then this, what we're looking at here, is sort of a before, where it's the start dot, and then after it's done, you have the separated ink. So before and after there. All right. Stationary phase, mobile phase. Very good. Okay, another thing that you can do with ink analysis, not just separating it out to look at the components, because that might help you differentiate two blue inks that look the same to the naked eye. The other thing that can help you differentiate two blue inks that look the same to the naked eye is using an alternative light source. Because again, if the ink contains different dyes or pigments, some of those may fluoresce differently, some of those may absorb light differently, and even though under normal white light they both look blue, if you start to put it under different types of light, UV light, infrared light, even different colored light, like sometimes red ink will disappear under red light, but if it has some other components in it that absorb red light, then it may sort of look more like a gray color. All right, so all these inks, when you put it through UV or a variety of visible light of different colors or infrared light, the ink will either glow, become transparent, where you sort of can't see it, it disappears, or nothing will happen. It'll just sort of turn gray and look pretty much the same as it did under normal white light. All right. So again, if you look at two different inks that appear blue under normal white light, you may shine a UV light on them and find that one has fluorescent components and starts to glow and the other does not. Well, that's a trait that's different, so you could safely say that those two inks came from different sources. Now, you could get a bunch of different light sources out, a bunch of different colored flashlights and a bunch of different colored goggles, and sort of go through all this manually. But because you're switching the light source and you're switching the filters so rapidly, and you want to sort of see what the inks look like under all sorts of combinations of light and filters, there's actually an instrument that will do this for you, and it's called a VSC, or Video Spectral Comparison. And you can see what this VSC is right here by Foster Freeman. It's a big box, all right, and this just sort of opens up like a hinge, and then you can slide your paper or driver's license or any other, or check, as it looks like they're looking at a check here, into the instrument, close the door, and then using software, because the computer has hooked up and run it, you can basically just cycle through and take images of that document using, a whole bunch, like hundreds of different combinations of light and filters. And then the software, or manually, you can sort through it in order to see if you can pick up any differences or any interesting traits that the ink shows. Okay. Now, what's on the fake computer screen here is sort of an obvious answer, or an obvious use for this VSC, where you can see they're shining, and I'm not sure if this is infrared light or if this is a UV light that they're shining on it. But you can see here that under this light and filter conditions, the 8000 and the black box all look very similar, okay, indicating that the 8 and these last 3 zeros were written with the same pen. But there was kind of a lot of space there. Somebody came in and erased the comma here and squeezed in an extra 0, taking it from 8,000 pounds to 80,000 pounds. Well, that's a pretty, beneficial counterfeit job where you've made yourself an extra 72,000 pounds or whatever this symbol is. Okay, so again, you could do this manually with flashlight and goggles, but this VSC just makes it so much easier. All right, so this shows some of the things in addition to the picture that we saw on the computer screen of what might happen, the glow, transparent, or nothing. So if you have 2 red inks, okay, that you're comparing, you may put them under UV light here, which this is the PowerPoint award-winning art that I keep bragging about. And you can see, oh, they both still look red under the UV light. Okay, but it's possible that you may shine UV light on these 2 red inks, and one of them sort of absorbs the ink and it just turns this darker color. So again, it's just a matter of looking to see if the 2 inks that you're comparing, your known and your unknown sample, behave the same under all of these different alternate lights, or whether they behave differently. Find one trait that's different, then you can eliminate the ink as having come from that source. But if they're all the same, then it turns into a case of, okay, what is this ink? How rare is this ink? And that is something where you may need the company's help to answer those questions with. Okay. And as we saw in that previous example on the computer screen, the alternate lighting may indicate alterations within a document, because obviously if you're comparing an unknown document to a known document, or unknown ink to a known ink, then you're comparing them as 2 separate samples. The threatening letter plus the known sample that we took from that we made with the suspect's pen. But it may also be where you're trying to determine whether there's 2 inks in the same document. Somebody scratched out the name, erased the name Jason Linville and wrote in Kristen Linville, in my parents' will. Oh, I'm going to get my sister, she wants all of their, I don't know, stuff. What is the plates? Is that what she wants? I don't know. I don't know. My parent, the minivan? Is that what she wants? Has low mileage on it, but excuse me. All right, so in this example, which is like a duck in a noose, it looks like somebody had erased the word goose and wrote the word duck on top of it, although I'm not sure why. When I made this lecture, it was fresh off the DC snipers, the serial killings in Washington, D.C., and there was a really strange note that was left, a cryptic note that was left by the shooters, and that was a phrase in one of them. But anyhow, okay, so that's ink analysis. I mean, throw it in the VSC, and look at it, and maybe thin layer chromatography may also help you out as far as looking at the different components. But you're always going to be comparing either a known to an unknown, a threatening letter to a known sample from the suspect's pen, or comparing ink within the same document to see if there's been any alterations made. All right, paper analysis is sort of similar. You may compare the paper from a threatening letter to the paper from a known stack of stationery in the suspect's house, or you may be comparing two pieces of paper within the same document. You know, the same thing goes back to a will. Maybe my sister didn't just erase my name and put in her name. Maybe she ripped out that page of the will and then made a copy of it and alterations and then stuck it back in with her name on that fake paper that she made. And then there also may be a question as far as how old the paper is and is it authentic. All right, so when it comes to class characteristics of paper, and again, a lot of these characteristics are referring to if you're looking at one document to see if somebody's pulled the old switcheroo, you know, one paper out and a replacement paper in. You can look at the number of staple holes because oftentimes documents are stapled and then the staple's removed and then it's restapled. So if you see 3 sets of staple holes in a document, except one page only has 1 set of staple holes, then that suggests the person who last copied it and took the staple out, you know, put in a fresh piece of paper in there. So that's, you know, one thing that might be different. Also, just the chemical composition of the paper, different additives. So you can either tell this by looking at paper again under alternative light. Sometimes the VSC will help you out with paper. Or do some type of chemical testing for additives, although there's not a lot of common tests to do for that. So a lot of it's more detecting these additives by just looking at it visually. I mean, have you gone to buy paper, you know, recently, especially if you're at Office Depot or something? They have a lot of different papers. They all have like brightness ratings and different, thicknesses, gloss or flat. My parents were in town visiting and they bought some white paper because I'd run out, and I guess they didn't care for the yellow paper that I had in my printer. It's like super thick. It's like, I don't know, high quality counterfeit document paper or something. So you can just look at and observe paper and notice some of these differences in it. And then obviously the last one, watermarks. If it's a company paper that has a hidden watermark in it, then that becomes very difficult to duplicate. Okay, so you can look at paper, you can look at pen. As is often the case now, you can look at the machine that was used to create the document. And when it comes to machine analysis, because, you know, ink analysis, we didn't talk a lot about toner analysis. A lot of toners look very similar, but that's sort of the same thing. But in the process of putting toner on paper or ink on paper with a typewriter, the machine can sometimes leave marks on the paper as well. Some printers, and I haven't been able to get good information on how frequent this is, may put like little intentional marks on the papers to mark that the paper had been processed with either a certain copy machine or a certain printer. But more often, these individual characteristics or individual marks from printers or typewriters come with just defects in the machine. I mean, most of us have probably had a printer that, you know, always smears the ink down at the bottom, or it prints it a little bit off center or something along those lines. So you can look at these little traits of how different printers may produce slight differences in otherwise identical documents, and categorize these to try to trace it to the machine that made the document. The example that I always like to give, which I was going to try to get a clip today, but I couldn't remember my mother-in-law's Hulu password, is an episode of the Brady Bunch. This is a story I always tell during the question document lecture. All right, and are you guys familiar with the Brady Bunch? Just one person put, yeah, I know the Bradys, and they made movie. Okay, good, thank you, Sarah. They made movies about the Brady Bunch too. But the classic TV show Brady Bunch, which was on like in the late 70s, early 80s. So the story, there's a man and something happens to a wife. He has 3 lovely boys. And then there's this woman, Carol Brady, who knows what happened to her husband. And she has 3 girls. And sure enough, Mike and Carol meet and they fall in love. So all of a sudden, there's 6 children in the house, 3 sisters and three brothers, and hilarity ensues. Well, one episode that relates to question documents, don't worry, I'm getting there, is Jan, the middle Brady, the middle girl child. She received a locket in the mail. Somebody, like a jewelry, like, you wear it around and you open it up, and I don't know if there's anything inside, but I think it said something creepy like you're special or something. But that's what the note said, okay? Like, to a special girl, I can't remember, but it was a locket. Okay, and unlike now, if that happened, like 10 or 12, like a 12-year-old girl receives a locket in the mail, somebody's calling the police. But the Bradys thought it was nice. They're like, oh, a secret admirer for our 12-year-old daughter. How nice. And we're the least bit concerned with where, well, they didn't leave a note. Oh, well, I guess we'll never know. So that was the parents' attitude. But you think those kids are going to settle for not knowing where that locket came from? No, they have 30 minutes to figure it out. So they really put their heads together. And what they noticed is on the envelope, which would be considered a document, that the locket came in, they noticed that when Jan Brady was typed at Janbrady, the Y was lower than the other letters. And this was, of course, in the 70s, so it was written with a typewriter. So the Bradys, thinking like true forensic scientists, said, oh, well, that looks like almost like an individual characteristic there. Okay, if we can find the typewriter, if we can find the machine that has that lower Y in it, then we can with confidence say that that was the typewriter used to type this envelope, and therefore we will know who the secret admirer is, or the secreter. I don't know what you'd call it when you send a 12-year-old girl a locket in the mail. So, man, they had to come up with some ideas. Nobody suggested a creepy dude who lived down the street. Maybe it was mom. Why wouldn't she just tell Jan? It doesn't matter to these kids. So they go and they find Carol Brady's typewriter. I'm not sure why she had one. They put a piece of paper in. They're like, Jan, Janbrady. Even. Right across. Individual character that characteristics does not match. Could not be mom's typewriter. I know what you're thinking. Oh, well, they probably gave up and ended the episode. No, they didn't. The kids thought even harder. Maybe it was dad. These are clever children. So they go into Mike Brady's office, get his typewriter out. I don't know why every individual family member had their own typewriter. Put a piece of paper in Janbrady. Right across. Man, can't be dad. So what do you think you're going to do? Think they're going to get... when I first told this, I misremembered the episode until I recently saw it. Again, it's on Hulu, and I think it's also on CBS Access. If anybody pays for that. I thought they actually did give up. Like, that's how the episode ends, with them giving up. But then it comes back like after the credits. And I don't know why the kids... There's literally 9 people in the show. Okay? It's the kids, mom, dad, and the housekeeper, Alice. Okay, but they weren't even. So at the end of the show, Alice, she brings out her typewriter, because Alice also had her own typewriter, and she put it on the table, and she says, Jan, I want you to type your name. And at this point, Jan has no idea what's going on. She's sitting there going, oh, okay, I'll type out my name, and she types out Janbrady, and sure enough, the Y is lower. That's an individual characteristic that matches. So they know it came from, although Alice had also just confessed to doing so. So at the end, they solved the crime with a little help from the person who wrote the letter. But it was still a good example in that episode of using machine analysis to detect this individual characteristic. And they did a little sleuthing there as well. And I know I don't want to leave you on the edge of your seat. Turns out that when Alice was a child, she was also a middle child and knows what it's like to be neglected. So she just wanted to do a little something special for Jan, but not let the other kids know so they wouldn't feel jealous of the live-in housekeeper, giving a child jewelry. All right, here. Very nice. All right, let's move on to. You could probably rewrite that in modern times with a printer or something. Because Lord knows everybody in my house, we have our own individual printers that we use. Okay. By the way, if everybody is writing your own Roy Moore jokes at home, please keep them to yourselves. Now is neither the time nor the place for that. Although it is November 9th, 2017. Look it up. Okay. Let's go on to counterfeit documents. With counterfeit documents, and this is really, it's not even mentioned in the chapter of the book, which is a little bit disappointing to me. When I did the review of the book, I suggested they put something in here. Because if you go to lab, like we've had two of the graduates from the UAB Forensic Science program become question document examiners. And they originally both worked for the Secret Service, which did question documents. They had a question documents section in the Secret Service, which seems a little bit strange, but historically it made sense. But then those labs were scaled down, and they moved over to Customs or ICE, who does a lot of authenticity of documents. I mean, obviously, you have driver's license, passports, work visas, social security cards. There's a lot of documents to establish identity that are, for whatever, a wide variety of reasons, oftentimes law enforcement runs into counterfeit documents. So they get sent to ICE and they authenticate them. Okay, so there are certain markers on driver's license or currency to make them very difficult to counterfeit. I mean, with currency, if you look at a dollar bill or a $5 bill here, and I don't have my UV light here in the room, and the webcam gets taken out of the lecture anyway, so I can't really say it. I need to take some good photos of this. But in like a $5 bill and a $10 bill and a $20 bill, if you hold it up, you'll notice like there's a piece of foil. I think there's one in the 5. There's like a piece of foil going through the dollar bill, and if you hold that under alternate light, it also fluoresces as well. It turns like either a yellow, an orange, or a reddish color depending on the currency. And that is something where if I just tried to print out a picture of a $5 bill on a piece of paper in my printer, it wouldn't have a lot of those features in it. Also, the paper that dollar bills or that current U.S. currency is made on has all of these little like colored threads in it. They're very interesting if you look at them under a microscope. And they also have the way that the ink is placed on, like the dollar bill, it sort of has a feel to it. It's because the ink is not printed on with like a laser printer, but it's actually pressed on with plates. Probably have heard of plates to make currency. So the ink is sort of pressed onto the paper, and it sort of sits on top of the paper, which gives it a almost like a rough feel to currency. And there's a lot of very tiny markings that you can't just have, with a normal laser printer. So in other words, counterfeiting currency is very difficult thing to do. And you can't just do it, go out and buy a really nice laser printer and then scan a copy of a $5 bill and print some out. For driver's license, if you look at your Alabama driver's license, which again I'll hold up here, but is not going to be part of the recording, you'll notice that on the Alabama driver's license, and maybe this is what I was going to be put into version 2.3, a picture of driver's license. If you look at the Alabama driver's license, you have a bunch of squiggles, like blue and red squiggles at the very bottom of a Alabama driver's license, and you'll notice a very thin red line at the top. Well, if you put that red line underneath the microscope, you'll notice that it's not just a red line, and it's not just a bunch of dots. It actually is font, and it says State of Alabama, State of Alabama, State of Alabama. All right, that's something where you just can't send the font to your printer to size, 0.002 and just print out something. A normal printer doesn't have that detail. In fact, if you notice when you go to get a license, what happens? They give you a quick printout of one that's your temporary license. But then you get your authentic document in the mail a couple weeks later. Why? Because it takes time to make a driver's license with all these security features in it. The other thing is if you do have a UV light, look at a driver's license under UV light. It has a big seal of Alabama that you can't see under normal light. And that's another interesting security feature because If you've ever done any traveling, when you're in the security line at the airport and you give them your driver's license, you'll notice that they always do two things. They look at it under a microscope or some type of magnifier. So they're looking at the font to look at those little features. And they also look at it under UV light. So they're looking at that state of Alabama seal. And those are just two really simple things you can do with documentation to determine if it's authentic or not. All right. We're going to move on to handwriting analysis now. So somebody writes, like either a suicide note or a threatening note, or something that indicates that they're going to go on, become a serial killer or something like that. Then you may want to identify the handwriting of the individual. All right. So handwriting can become important if, again, you're trying to link a handwritten letter to a person. Whether it's threatening or even if it's a forged signature, although that's a much smaller sample. Also forged signatures on prescriptions or forged signatures on wills or other documentation. But we're going to talk more about handwriting in general and not just focus on signatures. But we want to talk about the concepts, okay? Because in order to be able to do handwriting analysis and say, yeah, this piece of handwritten material was written by this person and no one else, we need to answer the question, is handwriting specific to an individual? All right, because if handwriting is different among individuals, then that's obviously a good thing. But if it's not specific to an individual, or if multiple people have the same handwriting, then obviously that's not good as far as to use as a forensic science tool. Yeah, this handwriting matches Jason Linville's, but thousands of people write the same way. Okay, also, if my handwriting changes over time, like I write a threatening letter to, I don't know who like CBS, okay, come on, only 9 episodes of Brady Bunch are free on your CBS app. You expect me to pay $5.99 a month just to watch the episode of the Brady Bunch where Jan gets a locket? I'm not paying $6 a month for that. To which they'll reply, well, we have a lot of fantastic original programming. You sound like a nerd. How about Star Trek? I'll say, I don't want to watch a new Star Trek, even though I actually do. Okay, so, and all this is done in threatening letters, right? And then at the end, I say, I'm going to get you Les Moonves. Watch out. And Julie Chen, too. Okay, so if I write that threatening letter to Les Moonves, I don't know how it came to this, okay, and then 2 weeks later my handwriting's different, then it doesn't even matter if you do the handwriting because my handwriting changes over time. So we need to establish, because if our indication is, yeah, everybody has different handwriting, sort of, and my handwriting doesn't really change over time. It's sort of the same next week as it is today. All right. The first question I want to look at is, does your handwriting change over time? I mean, hey, let's compare it to the handwriting in second grade. Is your handwriting the same today as it was in second grade? Probably not. And usually, although schools are changing, most of them, according to a raise of hands in the last on-campus course I had, most of you still have learned how to write cursive in elementary school. And most of you still take handwritten notes in high school, more or less. So what happened to me, and how the book describes this, is that when you're very young and learning how to write cursive, or even learning how to print, what are you doing? You're trying to match the letters that are on the chalkboard, above the chalkboard. Okay, so you're just trying to write, like, this is what an A looks like. Everybody tries to make that exact copy. So in second grade, when you're learning to write, everybody has a slightly different skill set, but everybody's handwriting sort of looks the same because you're trying to copy those letters. My mother often tells me that I had beautiful handwriting in second grade, and I'm not sure what she thinks she's gaining from those comments at Thanksgiving dinner, but anyhow, the implication is right now I write like garbage, and somehow that makes me a bad person. Anyhow, I'm not here to talk to you guys about this. I'll save that for Monday evenings and my therapist. All right. Excuse me. Then, for me, beautiful handwriting in second grade, Jason Linville, which was my nickname through 8th grade. I had Mrs. Hamilton for science. Okay, what happened in 8th grade science? Mrs. Hamilton's version of teaching was putting a transparency on the overhead projector and having everybody copy it from the transparency into their notebook. And she would say some words like photosynthesis or something. She'd sometimes read part of it. Great. So you just be writing as fast as you can, right? Well, you're not going to make a perfect A when you're writing as fast as you can, okay? Or make a beautiful O and then come all the way back around before you go into your N. No, you're going to learn how to modify your handwriting to write very quickly, okay? And maybe it's not in Miss Hamilton's 8th grade science class, but somewhere in your adult life, you learn that you need to write quickly and you modify your handwriting. And it's through this modification process that everybody adapts their handwriting and everybody's handwriting becomes a little bit different, okay? How you shorten your O's and your N's is a little bit different than the way I shorten my O's and my N's. And by your late teenage years, as you get through high school, it's sort of where you've set this modified way of writing and it doesn't change much through your adult life. Okay? That's sort of the general rule of thumb. So if you write a threatening letter to Les Moonves today, we come and arrest you 2 months later, your handwriting's still going to be the same. Unless you try to fake it, which we'll talk about later. Excuse me. It's sick this week. All right. So if Les Moonves calls the cops and he has this threatening letter, they need to come to my house and they need to get a known sample, right? It's always the unknown is the threatening letter. They need to compare it to a known sample. So there's 2 ways to get known samples for handwriting. All right. And I want you to understand the 2 ways you can get known samples and also the advantages and disadvantages of both of those. Okay, the first is a requested sample. That's where the police come in and say, hey, come down to the station. We need to collect your handwriting. They give me a piece of paper and they say, write this. Okay, the good thing about that is you can mimic the conditions. So if the threatening letter was written on with a ballpoint pen on a piece of construction paper, then they can give me a ballpoint pen and construction paper. Okay, the other thing is they can get a really big sample with a lot of letter combinations. What we do in one of the forensic science labs is there's this set letter that handwriting analysis have the people write, and that it has a whole bunch of different letter combinations in it. So it's a really good known sample. You could also have them rewrite the exact same letter. Okay, they could show me the Les Moonves letter and say, write this letter or read it out to me. And then they would be able to directly compare my handwriting from me, that they know is from me, to the same words in the same order on that letter to Les Moonves. But obviously, if they ask me to do that, I may try to disguise my writing. So that's one of the bad things about requested sample. If I'm being brought in and asked for a handwriting sample, I'm probably going to know, they're trying to match it to that threatening letter I wrote to Les Moonves, president of CBS, husband to Julie Chen. All right. But for handwriting examiners, they have ways around fake writing. I mean, they'll make you write something over and over and over. It's difficult to keep up fake handwriting for a long period of time. All right, the other way to get a known sample is a non-requested sample where they just come into my house and they grab things. They grab all of my notebooks with my secret manifestos in them. They grab a bunch of handwriting samples and they just take those as known samples. So it's good because you can't fake those. Okay, when I wrote my secret letter to Roma Downey 3 months ago, I wasn't thinking, oh man, they're going to come and pick this up after I write a threatening letter to Les Moonves. Okay, so it reveals normal writing habits usually. The only bad thing is that sometimes you don't have a lot of samples. If you went through my house now, you maybe get a couple grocery lists. I do have a couple notebooks in my backpack, but there's not a whole lot of handwriting samples. I don't know how much of your own handwriting you have in your house. And also, they need to authenticate it. Since they didn't see me write it, I could claim that it was written by somebody else. But, what the real murderer broke into my house and wrote in my notebooks, that, might not hold up. But those are some of the issues with that. Okay. So what is the examiner looking for? So what are the traits of handwriting? I mean, slant and spacing, height ratios of different letters, like how high are your T's and your H's compared to your O's and your A's? How far down do you go on your P's and your G's? Also, letter combinations when it comes to slant and spacing. Like a lot of people write a combination of print and cursive, and so they'll connect two letters, or they may keep the letters separate. You know, if you write at AT, some people will connect the A to the T, some people will write them separately. All right. Also, how you start letters, how you end letters, the size of the letters. Forgot I must have been talking in my 2 lectures today more than I thought. I'm losing my voice here at the end. Okay. So there's a lot. I think this is the last slide. So earlier, when we saw that threatening letter that ended with I am so lonely, if we take that unknown sample here and we compare it to a known sample, we bring in our suspect, we have him write out, and then we can compare it side by side, and we can see, oh, look at those. Same letter combinations, and this is actually Dr. Linville being lazy and just copying and paste the same exact handwriting sample, but you get the general idea. You can put them side by side and compare them. And I think at one time I had a more elaborate example where it turns out that the person who was so lonely was in fact Dane Cook, comedian. And it's back when Dane Cook wore tank tops and I did an impression of him, but I really need to be standing up so I can squat down low to the floor and talk in a special type of pattern. And plus nobody knows who Dane Cook is anymore. What good is a Dane Cook impression if nobody knows who Dane Cook is? All right. Is that it? Please. Everybody's shouting. All right. So pause before you leave the room. Make sure, like I think Carly jumped in there. So make sure your name's called before you leave the room and that you get credit for attendance. I will also take questions at this time about class or about the lecture. And leave the recording running a little bit, and then I'll stop the recording if you guys want to ask me any questions off the record. All right. All right, Brianna, I got you. Let's see here. Carly, let me write down your name. All right, Jennifer, I got you. JR, I got you. Sarah, I got you. All right, so everybody is free to go. All right, everybody, also I mentioned this. I guess I'll throw this in at the end for anybody still listening to this recording. In the fall of 2017, and maybe another semester as well, you have projects coming up. And for next Monday, I think what it says in the module is turn in your project idea or something to Dr. Linville, and there's an announcement that goes along with it. And what it says is you don't get points, you don't lose points. I just want everybody to be thinking about it. Everybody realize that the deadline is Friday before you leave for Thanksgiving. So that means you just have one weekend to get it done coming up. Online class, I'll give you permission to work solo because I understand it's tough to find a partner in an online class. But if you can't use the discussion board to locate a partner, then sometimes it's easy or more fun to do the assignment with somebody else. So that's all I'll say about that. Okay, that's it. I'm going to stop the recording. Feel free to ask any random questions. Otherwise, you may jump out of the room, and I'll see you guys next week.